Well, again, good afternoon. My name is Paul Conway. I'm with the Canadian Club of Edmonton, and welcome to today's luncheon presentation. A little bit about the Canadian clubs. There are Canadian clubs across Canada, and they offer an important forum for conversations that Canadians want to have as they engage in the fabric of our Canadian society. So I encourage you to stay involved with your local Canadian club, and of course the Edmonton membership. We always enjoy getting together. Here in Edmonton, we have pivoted, of course, thanks to COVID, to online presentations free of charge for the duration of this year and well into 2021. We certainly invite you to visit our website and subscribe to our newsletter if you're not already a member of the Canadian Club. We hope to be offering some great presentations, and we keep you informed about what's happening with other Canadian clubs across the country. At some point in 2021, of course, we hope to return to in-person luncheons here in Edmonton, downtown at the Chateau Lacombe. So do stay posted as we navigate the pandemic together and stay safe in the interim time. I'd also like to note that there is an active Canadian club in Calgary, and we've enjoyed sharing details of today's presentation with the Calgary membership. You might, for any of you that are in the Calgary area that are not part of the Canadian Club of Calgary, you might want to visit their website and take note of their upcoming events. In fact, they have an event coming up on December 17th with Linda Cody from the Pembina Institute. So that would be worth catching as well. Let's move now to acknowledging that Edmonton is located on Treaty 6 territory. And we acknowledge the histories, language, and cultures of all First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples whose presence continue to enrich our communities. So while today we meet virtually from several cities and several provinces, as individuals, we all participate on lands previously occupied by Indigenous peoples. We are encouraged to remember that their heritage and history, as well as the important contributions of many races and cultures in our shared history of settlement and immigration. Let us begin then by acknowledging that for thousands of years, Indigenous peoples have walked these territories, weaving their identity and spirituality intimately with the land. We acknowledge with respect that we live, work, and play on lands often delineated by treaty or otherwise occupied by settlers. Keep us mindful of the many covenants and treaties that we have made and often broken with our Indigenous peoples. Knowing that they have suffered, may we find new ways to live with respect on this land, moving into reconciliation as we journey forward together. And reconciliation is, of course, the theme of today's presentation. Now, this is the second time that I've had the honor of introducing Moran. The last time we had several hundred folks online. Today's audience is a little bit more intimate, so there'll be lots of opportunity for you to put questions into chat and to engage with Rai. I know he enjoys every opportunity to share his passions. With your permission, Rai, I'm going to do a slightly longer introduction than I perhaps did last time, because not everybody online has had an opportunity to read your biography. So Rai is actually born in Leduc, Alberta, right just south of the city here in Edmonton, although his family moved to British Columbia at a very young age. Rai, of course, has been the founding director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation since its inception 7 years ago, and only recently retired from that position. Prior to that, he was, of course, working with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, where he served as their director of statement gathering and the national research component. He was there since 2010. He has taught at the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity. He's a major contributor to the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada. He directly assisted in the development of a national reconciliation research strategy through his work with the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Rai works closely with the Canadian School of Public Service on a variety of executive training and learning initiatives. And he's worked with truth commissions around the world. At the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, his particular focus was on honoring the wishes of survivors to remember and honor the children who never returned home from the residential schools. You may have heard him speak previously on national television and radio to this subject. He's been part of a special national broadcast in 2019, and he worked with Gord Downey on the Secret Path project. Prior to joining the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Rai was active in many areas, including Indigenous language revitalization and the arts. He is a musician. He has produced original music for children's television, and he's the recipient of a Canadian Aboriginal Music Award in 2007. Love to hear more about that, Rai. He's the recipient of the Governor General's Meritorious Service Cross, a National Aboriginal Role Model Award. He's a University of Victoria Distinguished Alumni, declared such in 2018. And he was more recently featured in We Are Canada, which is a 6-part CBC series that aired in 2018 regarding Canadian groundbreakers, innovators, and visionaries. Now, Rai, of course, has, whether he's escaping the cold or the COVID, he has escaped and departed Winnipeg and is now settling in Victoria. He has an adventurous spirit. He's looking forward to his return to Vancouver Island. His kids are in school there. He enjoys kayaking, climbing, and all that the left coast has to offer. He's busy establishing himself now as the inaugural Associate Librarian for Reconciliation at the University of Victoria. Rai, on that note, welcome back to these online forums. We look forward to your presentation. I'm going to turn the microphone over to you, and I know you have some PowerPoint to share. Welcome.
Wonderful. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Paul, and good day to you all. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territories of the Wasanik people, where I did grow up. It's actually a very lovely return back to Vancouver Island here. I'm just, 6 minutes away from my family home and where my folks still are. Traditionally, I should introduce myself to Dijanakas Wapiganyu Mekanak Dodem. I just introduced myself with my spirit name, which is a white golden eagle, and says that I'm part of the Turtle Clan. I am Métis from the Red River. My time spent living in Manitoba over about the last 11 years or so was a very wonderful opportunity for both myself and my family to reconnect with those lands. Of course, the cultures out there, and it's been an absolutely incredible journey that I've been on and my family has been on as we've done all this really adventurous and comprehensive work of truth and reconciliation across the country over the last number of years. It is a pleasure to be speaking with you today, and I think I do have a PowerPoint presentation to share to you just to frame up the conversation that we're going to be having. I want to talk about our identity as a country, who we are, where we came from, and of course where we're going. You can actually hear these 4 fundamental questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Who am I and where am I going? Asked in pretty well every speech that is given by Senator Murray Sinclair. And they're very important questions, not only for us as individuals, but for us as a society. Certainly, the work of truth and reconciliation that we've all been a part of has presented us not only with a lot more information, but has also challenged us to reimagine ourselves as Canadians, as a country. It's challenged us to better understand our history, and certainly has challenged us with many questions about what we do with all this information that we now have the benefit of knowing about. So I'm just opening my presentation here, and here we are. Great. So, you know, I not that I want to leave a picture of myself up on the screen, but I do want to talk a little bit about this picture because I think it poses a couple of questions, and you saw it in probably some of the promotional materials for this talk. So why is a Métis guy holding a West Coast paddle on the banks of the Red River? And it's a very legitimate question. That paddle actually tells us something about this journey of truth and reconciliation that we're all on. In 2015, we can remember that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued its 94 calls to action, a 7-volume report, comprehensive, thousands and thousands of pages of material. In the fall of 2015, the university sector got together and said, okay, what are we going to do about this? What are our responsibilities as a sector towards our students, towards our faculty, towards our communities in responding to these calls to action? Throughout all of the TRC's work, and really throughout most Indigenous cultures, I would say, physical objects often represent very important teachings or guidances for us as we walk upon these paths that we walk. And at that particular forum in 2015, the Building Reconciliation Forum of the university sector, a very important object was created, and it was a walking stick, actually. And this walking stick was intended to help the leaders and the faculty and the community at the institutions that were hosting the conference to not just talk about reconciliation, but fundamentally to walk the talk. It recognized that we're on a journey. We all need to help one another. But most importantly, shallow words or nice promises aren't going to actually create the transformative change that we need to see in society. It requires action, it requires commitment and dedication. Now, how does this relate to this paddle that I'm holding? Well, what happened along the journey with that initial walking stick that was created is along the way, some of the people that were holding it kind of forgot that they had to do the work. They forgot that it wasn't merely going to be words that would help us on this path of reconciliation. And in one case, they actually forgot the walking stick. They left it behind. So the elders sat down and said, you know, something's not working right with this walking stick. So 3 new objects were created. And these 3 new objects are going to frame part of this conversation, a large part of this conversation that we're having. Those 3 objects are those paddles. I'm holding one, and that sits at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. There's another one here at the University of Victoria. And then there's another one that's traveling throughout the university sector. These particular paddles were designed by a very talented artist by the name of Carey Newman. He was the person that created the witness blanket, an incredible piece of art and social memory, and painted by his father that was a residential school survivor. Now, why 3 paddles and why paddles at all? Well, each one of these paddles represents a component of the past, the present, and the future. And when we think about reconciliation, it's actually the coming together of these 3 elements: the past, who we are, where we came from; the present, what are our actions that are required today; and the future, why are we doing this work? Where are we going? How can we leave a world that is better for our children and our children's children? So this past, present, and future is a huge part of the memory work that's happening in this country, the social justice work, the uncertainty. But all of this is intended to drive us forward. So when we think about paddling in a canoe, we think about moving forward, sometimes through choppy waters. But we have to move forward, of course. And all of this work is about moving forward in a good way, learning from the past, looking backwards, but looking forwards to creating a much more positive set of futures for Indigenous peoples and the country as a whole. You've heard about my work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. I mean, these have been really honorable positions that I've held. I think back to the very first interview that I did with the commissioners when they were considering whether or not to hire me or not. And I recall saying in that meeting that, this would be the most important work that I could do in my life. And it has been, without a doubt. Having my kids was the most important part of my personal life, but certainly from a work perspective, I can't imagine a more fulfilling and enriching journey than I have been on through this work. And what have I had the opportunity of learning and hearing about? Well, a huge part of the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and of course the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, is the preservation of memory, the gathering and the opening up of space for survivors, their families, communities, to share what happened in those residential schools. We broke an incredible amount of silence during the TRC's work. And we can remember that but 10 short years ago in this country, that we weren't even having a conversation of residential schools in classrooms yet. There was really no jurisdiction 10 short years ago in this country that was talking about this incredibly horrific, very damaging, and absolutely fundamental part of our national history. The number of people that I've talked to that have said, I just didn't know about this is countless, And that is a result of really the deliberate and intentional silencing that happened for so long in this country. We just did not listen to Indigenous peoples. We would not hear their cries for justice. We did not create the spaces in our societies to properly include, honor, incorporate Indigenous perspectives, languages, cultures into the education system and a whole host of other aspects of our society. We have to celebrate the incredible strength and determination and courage of those survivors. We recorded over, just shy of 7,000 statements, 6,900 some odd statements. And we collected millions of pages of archival records from archives across the country. And all of this was intended to give the Commission an opportunity to study what happened, and most importantly, chart a future moving forward. And what did we find? Well, unfortunately, the bitter pill that we have to swallow as a nation is that we have had and continue to have some very serious individual and structural issues with racism, prejudice, and violence. You may have heard the term systemic racism be used a lot in the last year or 2 years or so. You may have heard major organizations like the RCMP struggle with coming to terms with these terms. You heard the commissioner of the RCMP say, well, I'm not sure if we have a problem with structural racism. I'm not too sure if we have a problem with structural prejudice. And the thing that we have to remember as a country is that we do have massive, fundamental, deep challenges and problems with structural racism, prejudice, and violence. The evidence is clear on this. And what structural racism is it is a system in which an entire group or class of people is systematically discriminated against. It's a different iteration of the hot racism that we see when people say direct things. It's something that is ingrained. It's something that prevents or bars Indigenous peoples sometimes from reaching positions of leadership. And certainly when we look across the country, we can see right now that we're still reaching many, many firsts. The first Indigenous heart surgeon, the first Indigenous judge in Manitoba, Murray Sinclair. I mean, we're still setting many, many firsts. And the fact that we're setting those firsts means that for a very long period of time, Indigenous peoples were being systematically barred from or excluded from our places. The residential schools thrived in this environment and were founded upon fundamentally racist notions of Indigenous peoples. And when we go back to the apology that was made by Stephen Harper in 2008, and when we listen to the words that he said at that time, some of the most important words that were spoken during that apology said that the attitudes and ideals that gave rise to the residential schools have no place in Canadian society. Residential schools were a manifestation of those ideas. Notions of cultural superiority, notions of religious superiority, notions that Indigenous peoples were inherently inferior to. And when we unpack those words, that the attitudes and ideals have no place in Canadian society, well, what that says to us as Canadians, indeed as members of the Canadian Club, says that as Canada, we have to do better. We have to all become part of this work of challenging these attitudes and ideals that are still very much present in our society. You know, when we traveled the country and we listened to as many people as we did, and we looked at the record and we looked at the evidence, and we looked at the health reports, we looked at the records of student treatment, we were left with this very bitter pill. This inescapable conclusion that the overarching systemic nature of the residential schools and all of the policies and all of the agencies that were involved in this, and the wholesale attempt to eradicate Indigenous cultures from this land, amounted to cultural genocide. And cultural genocide is not a lesser form of genocide, it's a form of genocide. So there's different, there's hot genocide, there's the genocide of the body. We're very familiar with that on an international stage. But cultural genocide is the attempt, the systemic, overarching, intentional effort to eliminate cultures from Canadian society. And of course, we know that there are many, many nations in the society. Long before settlers started arriving, there were thriving nations with complex governance systems, complex education systems, complex trade systems that had existed for millennia. All of that has come under attack over a very short period of time. And of course, was particularly evident through the residential schools. So the question behooves us as a country. If this is the case, if this is what the findings of the Truth Commission were, well, how do we need to situate Canada in and amongst a group of nations? Where else can we look around the world to understand what our actions need to be and what our steps need to be as we walk upon this journey of healing? Well, I want to provide you with a few examples of how, coming back to this theme of past, present, and future, different nations remember different aspects of their history. And one thing that we see clearly around the world is that we don't just remember the good stuff. That's important. More often, what we do is we remember the bad stuff. And why? Well, when we remember the bad stuff, when we remember where we as a human family failed, well, those serve as sentinels or guards to prevent those things from happening again. They're reminders, daily reminders of just how greatly we can fail one another, just how far we can fall when we don't uphold fundamental human rights principles, when we don't value life, when we don't see the gifts that each one of us bring. This particular memorial is a memorial that's at the killing fields in Cambodia, of course, another genocide in the world. A powerful reminder of the abuse, the death, the constant need to stand on guard against the recurrence of these terrible acts that happened. Looking down to Central and South America, we see many, many monuments down there. And of course, Central and South America, they've had multiple truth commissions operate down there. For context, there's been about, give or take, 80 Truth and Reconciliation Commissions around the world. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are transitional justice mechanisms designed to move a state from an inherent state of conflict to a state of restored or renewed relationship or peace. So that we have had a Truth Commission here in Canada says that there's something fundamentally amiss. These are transitional justice mechanisms that are deployed when there are mass human rights violations that have been committed by the state. And here in Chile, we see the Patio 29 memorial to the people that were disappeared in that particular conflict and the genocide there. Of course, we look to Western European countries as well, and we see the Holocaust Memorial here in Berlin and other places being preserved like Auschwitz, concentration camp. We know through this then that there's a power in remembering those things sometimes that perhaps are, very painful. But again, we come back to this idea of sentinels, standing on guard against recurrence, reminding us of our breaches or abrogations of human rights, our collective record of human atrocity and genocide around the world. And certainly that is something that is very much occurring here within Canada also. And that's where I want to turn to now is that we walk on this journey of past, present, and future. Well, what's happening here in Canada? Well, boy, I'm sure you've all seen the headlines. We have a very active conversation happening in this country right now about how we remember and who we remember. This one has been particularly inflammatory. Here in Victoria, the statue of Sir John A. Macdonald was removed from outside of City Hall after extensive consultation with the Indigenous community. Here in Montreal, this particular statue was toppled, and I'm sure many of you saw the news where the head actually came off of this statue. This is not something that Canada is alone in. All around the world, particularly, historically oppressed or marginalized communities are challenging and confronting our society and who we remember and how we remember them, and challenging us to, at the very least, ensure that the representation of these historical figures is at the least balanced, at the least inclusive of perspectives, for example, of residential school survivors or Indigenous peoples in the case of John A. Macdonald. And there is a powerful lens that we enter into, that there's a powerful lens that we can see this country through when, to echo the old cliche, when we try to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. Having heard all that I've heard, having experienced all that I've experienced, I can tell you that the Canada that Indigenous peoples know is not the Canada that most Canadians know. The historical figures that we see gracing our dollar bills or our banknotes and our monuments are oftentimes celebrating or uplifting or holding up the people that have deliberately and intentionally sought the destruction or demise of the cultures of Indigenous peoples and the nations. So we're confronted with this kind of particular nexus in this country right now where we're listening more, we're hearing more. And one of the things that I think is really important is that even though some of these conversations may be uncomfortable and even though they may be deeply challenging, is that we do sit in our discomfort, we do listen, we do understand why people are saying the things they're saying. That's that part of truth telling that's so fundamentally important. I think one of the most important things that the TRC did here was to provide audiences for residential school survivors. It gave the opportunity for Canadians to be changed, to learn more, simply through hearing what the experiences of those residential school survivors were. And I'll tell you from firsthand experience, there's no possible way that you could not leave one of those national events with a much deeper, a much more complicated understanding of our collective humanity as Canadians. You could not help but hear, you could not help but clearly experience and feel those human rights violations, because the emotion was there. The survivors had that voice. And people, of course, continue to speak out today. Now, for certain, we're on a very interesting trajectory as a country, though, too. And as much as we have these kind of big flare-ups and these controversies that start over, complex historical figures like Ryerson or Sir John A. Macdonald or others in our collective history, the inverse of that is a story that's really exceptionally positive. The Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada was referenced in the opening remarks by Paul there. This is a really important step as a country. It's a 4-part atlas commissioned by or sort of dreamed up by the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. 4 volumes representing a story on truth and reconciliation and that particular sort of journey that we've been on as a country. And then dedicated volumes on Inuit, Métis, and First Nations histories. What's so powerful about this is that we see that the Royal Canadian Geographical Society moving into that position of allyship that, frankly, all of our societies, all of our institutions really need to move into, wherein the goal and effort was to empower those Indigenous voices, empower the voice of the Inuit, empower First Nations voices, empower the Métis to tell the stories that they wanted to tell to Canada. The Royal Canadian Geographical Society was really kind of the gas in the tank and the engine that kind of drove the car, but the storytelling and the actual voices that are inside of that are straight from grassroots and Indigenous peoples across the country. And this is really a remarkable success story. This particular volume is in every single classroom in the province of Alberta, for example. It does things like shows the map of Canada with colonial borders and boundaries lifted off. It begins to help us imagine what this country was and really still is. It shows us really important locations like residential schools on the map that, the vast majority of Canadians still drive by not even knowing they're there. So this is a really positive step, a way that we're confronting our past, not being stuck there, but actually using this as a tool in the present to, of course, create a better future for tomorrow. And what's really powerful with this is we can think about kids growing up today with this knowledge. Kids growing up today with an image or an image of Canada or information on Canada that, again, the vast majority of Canadians weren't able to access in their own education. Some of the other really important work that has happened in this country over recent years is remembering the children that never returned home from the schools. This was something that I was very deeply involved with, and the photo on the left there is a picture of Métis National Council President Clément Chartier looking at a 50-meter long memorial broadcloth that lists the names of the students that never returned home from the residential schools on it. Up until we released those names in 2019, communities themselves, in some cases, didn't know what had happened to Anne or Bruce or Cecilia or Eliza. These kids would have been at the residential schools and maybe were sent away or maybe just disappeared. And the work here is still just at the outset. We've documented thousands of names and we've still only reviewed about 1/5 of the overall collection of material that exists at the NCTR. Now, why is this important? Well, when we look at the images on the right, You may have seen a very important national broadcast that happened this past year on Orange Shirt Day. Orange Shirt Day now is happening September 30th each and every year, and was started by a very thoughtful and passionate and dedicated survivor by the name of Phyllis Webstad, who had attended the Williams Lake Residential School here in BC. She says, every child matters. Every child of the past, every child of the present, every child of the future matters. So when we honored these kids with this memorial cloth, we were saying to those kids, you matter. You deserve to be remembered. You deserve not to be forgotten. We will remember you. We will hold your funeral that really you never had at that school. We will cry for you. And why? Well, that's setting things right in the past so that we can actually do things better in the present. Because really at the end of the day, I mean, kids are so sacred. When we talk about these big concepts of reconciliation or things like sustainable development or, you know, how we're walking in the world. This is all about not robbing from future generations, trying to make tomorrow better than yesterday. In this broadcast, we heard from a very talented dancer, traditional dancer from Stony, Ariel Waskowicz. She's pictured down on the right-hand side, and she talks about the complexity of all of this work, you know, walking in two worlds as an Indigenous person, maintaining one's foot firmly planted within the traditions, knowledges, cultures of these lands, being dedicated to that, but of course, being forced to walk in a world that still feels very foreign, very alien, and values different things. It is the coming together of these futures where Indigenous peoples themselves can see a positive future in society, where the creation of a Canada isn't coming at odds with Indigenous futures, where the real reconciliation lay. We too are a country that also is challenged with sites like this. Now, while different in scope and while the comparison, you know, can be fraught with problems, we certainly know that, you know, in post-World War II Europe, there was a question about what to do with the sites, what to do with the sites of atrocity. And this is, again, coming back to that large question overall. What do we do with these places where terrible things happened? This is a residential school that still stands in Western Manitoba. One of only about 16 that continue to stand in the country. You can see this one's very dilapidated. It's run down. It's been neglected. Most of the residential schools are not standing anymore. There was over 140 institutions, oftentimes with multiple versions of the building. And here we are in 2021 as a country, grappling with what do we do with these places? How do we remember? Are these sites of commemoration, memorialization, reflection? What's the relationship between a site like this and the education system? Between, you know, tourism, and they're big questions. And thankfully, what we see is that we are making some steps. We've taken some very important steps, actually, just recently as a country. This was, again, something that I was very intimately involved with at the NCTR. And just recently, on September 1st of 2020, we, after a great deal of petitioning, saw that the National Historic Sites and Monuments Board, which is the only board in Canada that recognizes either people, places, or events to be of national historical significance, recognized the entire residential school system as an event of national historical significance. The National Historic Sites and Monuments Board also recognized two residential school sites, the Portage La Prairie Residential School and the Shubenacadie School in the Atlantic, as places of national historical significance. Now, What does all this mean? Well, this means that this is Canadian history. This means that this history is history that we have to understand as a nation, as individual Canadians. This is not Indigenous history. This is the history of Canada. The National Historic Sites and Monuments Board has defined these places, and there's more to follow, as being places that we cannot forget, that we must not forget if we are to truly understand who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. There's also work happening right now. You can see, again, this is kind of breaking news. There was a committee hearing last week or 2 weeks ago in Ottawa, exploring action on call to action 80. Now, there it is in the slide, which was issued by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, calling for the federal government to establish a national day for truth and reconciliation. A national day where we have the opportunity as a country to come together, to reflect upon, and to look forward to our past and our present and our future. This is an exceptionally important day that's different than June 21st. Now, June 21st is National Indigenous Peoples Day. That particular call to action, that recommendation was made by the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which of course came out of another tragedy, which was the Oka crisis, in the early 1990s. National Indigenous Peoples Day, June 21st, summer solstice, is a wonderful opportunity to celebrate the vibrancy, the resilience, the diversity of Indigenous cultures. A National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is something different than that, though. It's more akin to a Remembrance Day. Again, not wanting to draw a direct comparison there because the histories are different. But it's a day for us to gather. It's a day for us to reflect upon what has happened. And most importantly, it's a day for us to redouble our efforts as a nation, as a country, to never again repeat those same mistakes of the past, to reflect on how many of the historical implications continue to reverberate today, and to keep our eyes firmly focused on the path that lay ahead and the work that still needs to be done to really reach that peaceful human rights framework that really I think most of us want. Now, Canada's journey of reconciliation, though, is also fraught. It's lurching. It's complex. Again, in terms of things that the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation has been involved with, and the TRC, I mean, I've been involved in almost a decade's worth of litigation now related to the protection of memory. It hasn't been a straight path. It has not been easy. It's really, really, really complicated because you've got all these kind of conflicting rights that are at the heart of these questions that have been asked. But what happened recently in the country, and what is still happening right now, is a fairly significant destruction of residential school materials. This went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And really the heart of the argument here was that the privacy of those residential school survivors that talked to certain programs within the residential school settlement agreement for the purposes of compensation, compensation for the very serious sexual and physical abuse that happened in the schools, should be destroyed in order to protect the privacy. And that the only way to protect the privacy was the complete destruction of recordings, transcripts, and decisions. This was a complicated case, and you'll see that the Supreme Court of Canada did rule unanimously that yes, these records should be destroyed. There is a process to allow survivors to still deposit them at the NCTR. But the reality is the vast majority of this record will be lost. And it is the best record of the worst abuse. And yes, it is the most horrific of horrific content, really. But we can see that we're still grappling with this issue of what we remember and how we remember it. And there's a conflict of rights sometimes around that which should be preserved and that which should be forgotten. Now, we can also see more recently, though, that the evolution of that case was such that there was a general effort to create large sets of statistical data detailing what happened in the residential school. So perhaps, the number of claims per school or the average compensation, so on and so forth, designed to give us a bit of a window into some of the questions that, quite honestly, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission wasn't able to answer and that are still big question marks for this country. And here, this quote on the right is an excerpt from the decision issued by the lower court judge, Justice Paul Perel out of the Ontario courts, saying, and just as the history of the Holocaust will not be different for knowing which was worse, Auschwitz or Treblinka, I do not see how Truth and Reconciliation will be advanced by reports identifying which school was the worst or ranking schools in the order on which school had, the abuse in it. So we understood that earlier case to be an issue of privacy, but now this seems to be one where the court is saying, well, this isn't really about privacy. This is just about on the value of the information. That, this particular judge in this case is saying, why understand, essentially? Why understand? Why understand what was happening? And the timelines around this, the challenges around this are actually quite significant. We're standing kind of on the precipice right now of losing our ability to run these reports entirely. The main database that contains this wholesale set of information that would at least give us a window into what the claims process, what the compensation process understood about the residential school's history, is actually slated for destruction by March 31st, 2021, right now. The NCTR has appealed this case to the Ontario Court of Appeals, and that matter was heard about 3 weeks ago. That other main body of evidence that was cited 2 slides ago about the survivor statements from the IAP process, that is slated to be destroyed in 2027. So we see that we're grappling with this. And I think one of the challenges that I've certainly seen as I've thought about what's happening around the world is that certainly if we looked at another country and saw that they had this record of genocide or this terrible record, and then they were really destroying the evidence, I think we would be concerned about that as a country. But of course, when things hit a little closer to home, it gets a little more complicated. And certainly in this case, the balancing of rights was really between privacy and what is important, and the value of this information has been highly contested. I want to bring us through a few concluding slides here, and then I'll have a chance for some questions here. Coming back to that statue of John A. Macdonald, there's a question about what we take down. That's a legitimate question. It's a fair question. There will be many perspectives on that. Okay. There's a question of what we add to. Okay. So how we increase our information, how we increase our understanding and contextualize some of these historical figures. And then there's the question about who else needs to be remembered in society. This fellow here, Fred Sasakamoose, I'm not too sure if you've seen the news, but we just lost him due to COVID yesterday. The first First Nations person to play in the NHL, 86 years old. He passed away in the hospital after being infected. As we look forward, what I want us to think about is who are the people that we should be honoring? Who are the people that went first? Who are these people that perhaps we don't even really know about yet as a society, but need to know about? I'd certainly put Fred Sasakamoose into this category. I'd also put Tommy Prince. one of Canada's most decorated Indigenous soldiers. If you go up to Broken Head Reserve, just north of Winnipeg, you'll see a gymnasium dedicated, or a big community hall dedicated to him. And certainly his name and his story is well known amongst the Indigenous community, but have Canadians really understood his contributions and the incredible contribution that many, many Indigenous peoples have made to building this country, to be what it is, to creating not only a Canada that is better than what it was, but, understands itself better and pursues this path of human rights? What about Nora Bernard? Yet another incredible warrior out of the Shubenacadie area in the Atlantic provinces. Her story, I would encourage you to look at her story. She met an incredibly unfortunate end and was murdered after having fought for years to have the residential schools case actually be recognized. And actually, her case ended up morphing into the overall class action settlement that was the largest out-of-court settlement in Canadian history and the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history. Nora Bernard, another person, as we look forward, somebody who's in our past, as we look forward, somebody who I believe absolutely should be recognized. And there's lots of people like this, lots of Indigenous peoples in this country that have been doing absolutely groundbreaking work to make a Canada that is better than what it was. Real Canadians that are standing up for human rights. People that are saying, this needs to change because we cannot continue to live this way. Justice, human rights, equity, fairness. These are very, very noble, very, very important elements of the overall work that we all need to be doing. And that's what we see reflected in the TRC's principles of reconciliation. Reconciliation is a process of healing of relationships that requires truth sharing, apology, and commemoration that acknowledges and redresses past harms. This is principle of reconciliation number 3. We're all part of this. We all have a role to play in this. We can all do something to commemorate those that we've lost, those that we need to acknowledge, and those that, we want to lift up and celebrate. We see this also reflected in the principles of reconciliation. All Canadians as treaty peoples share responsibility for doing this work of establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships. That establishment and maintenance of mutually respectful relationships is the definition of reconciliation that has been around in this country for a really long time. Establishing respectful relationships with our pasts, understanding these different perspectives, understanding the perspectives of Indigenous peoples, of Black peoples, of other historically marginalized groups. Maintaining those mutually respectful relationships in the present so that we're not harming one another today, that we're thinking consciously with our words. And then those mutually respectful relationships in our future. So we're not at odds with one another, that we're starting to see a path where Indigenous futures and futures of Canadians are no longer at odds with one another. That's the great challenge. That's the work of reconciliation. I put that link in the bottom there just to give you an opportunity that if you do want to learn more about some incredible Indigenous peoples that are entirely worthy of statues or monuments as we think about what's being torn down and what's being added to, I also want us to think about what we need to recognize and what we want to put up and who we want to lift up in our society and why we want to lift them up. And that is a really great link to look at some really incredible people. So this is the Bentwood box that, of course, was so central in all of the TRC's work. And on the front of it is the carver's story of his grandmother, who attended a residential school and was thrown down the stairs by one of the nuns in the school and had her fingers terribly broken and was left with a permanent disfigurement because she wasn't able to access the proper health services that she needed in the school after being thrown down those stairs. And when we remember our past, we remember that there's many painful stories. And this box, in so many ways, represents that journey of truth and reconciliation that we're all on as a country. Inside of that box, if you were to lift off the lid, it's empty. But really, it's filled full of a lot. It's filled full of hope, of dreams, of reflections, of commitments made by Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples alike. It's filled full of reflections on the past, of pain, of stories of anguish, and reminds us as a nation that we have to hold these things dear and reflect on them. They're there to help us. They're there to help us fulfill the broad human rights obligations that have been called for, have been hard fought for. And I think as we think about the long and complex history of rights, be they labor rights, be they the rights of women to vote, civil rights in the United States, it's always been an uphill battle. And it continues to be an uphill battle to this day. So when we see people out there fighting for their rights, remember that we enjoy many rights today that people fought hard for in the past. There's people out there doing the work each and every day to advance a better set of human rights principles in this country that do need to be recognized and celebrated. Now there's the logo of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And while I'm not there anymore, I'll just leave you with a couple brief words on it. The logo talks about a lot, but when we look at the logo of the TRC, we saw there were 7 fires in a circle, and we see there's this other fire that's burning at the heart of this NCTR's logo. Like all fires, this fire needs to be fed. So the question for us each is, what will we bring to this fire? What will we contribute individually to this fire? What will we contribute organizationally to this fire? And it may be a twig, it may be a stick, but the task and the opportunity is to keep this fire burning bright. So not only we will have a better country, but if we do it really, really well, we can actually be a beacon of light for the rest of the world. And I think we've still very much got that potential to fully realize and grow into, a foundation that's already been laid for us as Canada. So with that, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me.
And thank you, Rai. This is the second time we've had this opportunity, and I've heard you on the radio and other places as well. And one always gets the feeling or knows that you're speaking from your heart, and establishing mutually respectful relationships and how to do that, and the things that we can do in our daily lives and with our workplaces, families, and organizations. I think those are important questions to leave today's audience on. You and I have discussed before, this is a little bit personal for me. I attended high school in Sulakut, and relatively few white kids and an awful lot of Indigenous kids in grades 9 and 10 only. And I reflect back on that with some deep sense of embarrassment or shame, knowing that they were there, and I didn't treat them disrespectfully, at least not as an individual, but I didn't know a lot about them. And as I went to British history class and learned about British history and Indigenous cultures, even in other parts of the world, I knew nothing about these fellow students and the fact that they were being bussed in from a residential school not 20 kilometers away. And of course, after grade 10, they all disappeared for the most part. A few stayed on for grade 12 and 13, but very few. And as a person, I've learned from that, and I appreciate that. You bring some hard truths for us to consider. Black Lives Matter, Indigenous lives matter, systemic racism, cultural genocide. These are hard truths, And I appreciate you taking Vicky's question regarding, how do we recognize our colonial historical figures with some measure of context. It's difficult. It's very difficult. MacDonald, first prime minister, but these residential school experiences, throughout the world have been couched as, civilizing the natives, bringing God to the godless, educating the savages. These are the justifications that were used at the time, and we can look back at it with wiser eyes, and we can recognize the damage we've done. So I thank you for bringing those hard truths for us to consider and asking the tough questions. I will ask, one local question, if you will, if you may. If you've been following the news here in Alberta, and actually, before I get to that question, I'll just remind the audience that you can type any questions that you have or any comments or thoughts or thanks to Rye. You can type those in the chat box. We will do a hard stop in about 10 minutes, but I can certainly, take some questions. We are recording this. We'll try to post it if possible. Rye, here in Alberta, an education curriculum that was brought in by previous governments, the previous Conservative and NDP governments, has recently been relooked at by the current UCP government, and they're making changes now. And one of the, many changes to do with gender and all kinds of things, but one of the changes that they're recommending or planning to do is to remove the residential experience from the curriculum for the lower grades, the early grades, kindergarten through 3 or 4, thereabouts. I was just wondering if you could comment on your thoughts about that, because, I have a young son myself, and we try to cover some difficult topics.
Yeah, I found that to be a really disappointing step in Alberta, and was disheartened by that, because I think one of the things that we always talk about when we talk about education and truth and reconciliation is age appropriateness. And there's many ways to have age appropriate conversations with kids that still get at the heart of the intended lesson or outcome that you're trying to teach, but that do so in a way that doesn't create harm. All of this work about truth and reconciliation is guided by a bunch of fundamental principles, but the most important principle is do no harm. Do not create further harm, right? We got to turn down the volume on this violence and conflict, and really ramp up the peacemaking. There are ways that you can talk about fairness, sharing, identity with young kids that touch on the residential schools, but don't have to go into the deep, dark issues of sexual abuse. And I would never ever recommend those harder issues be taught at a young age, because it has to be age appropriate. I mean, at the same time, we also know too that we also remember really hard things that have happened in society. Again, Remembrance Day. I mean, we remember the sacrifice and terrible conflict, war. I mean, the Second World War was an absolutely horrific event. And we know that there's power in remembering. We know that there's ways that we can do that. We do that in our schools each and every year. And again, it's not the same as residential schools, but it has aspects that are the same. And we know that we can do things in ways that protect kids, but still help remind them that we have to stand on guard against the recurrence of these issues, and that these are fundamental and important things that we need to know. I think one of the big things that we see across, a lot of efforts right now is people having a degree of discomfort about how to teach this, and we don't have, 20, 30 years of curriculum under our belt yet as we delve into these subjects, and I think that's where we really need to redouble our efforts to ensure that teachers have as much training, support, and resources as they need to make sure that these lessons can be taught in a good way, in a safe way for those kids, but still taught nonetheless.
Thank you. That's very insightful and helpful to those of us that are here in Alberta. I want to congratulate you on your accomplishments with respect to the recognition of the residential school experience as an event, and the opening of, or the planned opening of, 2 national historical sites. I also wanted to thank you for the update on the legal challenges that have faced and continue to face the National Center. I know some of those are disappointing to you. We talked about those back in the last spring or the summer. And it is seemingly a shame to lose those records, but I did want to thank you for those accomplishments. What perhaps I could just ask, what do you hope is the next big accomplishment for the national effort in this regard? Will it be the day that you're talking about in September?
Yeah, I mean, the day is important. That's one part of the framework. When we talk about social memory and commemoration events, there's a national monument that is being planned as well. And there's also calls to action related to the creation of provincial monuments in every provincial capital across the country. So again, we think about, how do we remember? We need places to gather, we need places to come to. So we start thinking about a framework of memory. So national monuments, provincial monuments, local monuments, sites in specific, they're all part of that framework. Now, one of the big pieces that we have still yet to really see fully fleshed out, one is the National Council on Reconciliation. This is right in the middle of the TRC's calls to action. Both the TRC and a number of domestic agencies have recommended this, and international communities have recommended the need to establish a follow-up kind of monitoring body that really delves into whether or not we're achieving results on implementing the TRC's calls to action. Right now, I mean, in my all the media work that I've done, probably one of the most common questions that I get asked is, where are we at? What's actually happening? So I answer it as best I can, but that National Council is intended to actually do the actual systemic study, right? So our child welfare rates getting better or worse? And if they're getting worse, well, what the hell are we doing, right? What about incarceration rates? What about maternal health, right? Like, there's a whole bunch of key performance indicators, key milestones, key indicators that are articulated by the TRC that we have to be keeping an eye on. And we're not doing that at the national level yet, and that's really something fundamental. The other thing too that has long been discussed, long been sought, and a lot of people still struggle to understand it, but when we talk about reconciliation, it's a rights-based framework. It is about promoting and espousing an overall rise of human rights in the society. We have to recognize that Indigenous peoples are human, and Indigenous peoples have human rights, and those human rights are expressed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We do have to get serious about understanding that declaration and really look to implement that UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because it's a solution to prevent us from making the same mistakes as the past. It's a solution to actually keeping us from abrogating those human rights and just frankly creating a whole bunch of litigation or additional harm in the future.
Very insightful. Thank you, Rai, and really great questions. And thank you for updating us on the UN Declaration. Could you, forgive my ignorance, but could you briefly update our audience on exactly what Canada's position on that? I can't recall if we've signed it yet. I knew we delayed. We've certainly delayed.
Yeah, so Canada at the federal level, we were an objector for a long period of time, and then we were kind of like a non-commentator for a period of time. 2016, if memory serves me correct, we made a statement as a nation at the United Nations saying that we dropped any objections to it and were essentially endorsing it. Then we have made a number of statements domestically, and there has been legislation introduced at the federal level. That legislation did die on the order paper before the last federal election. It died in the Senate. I do understand that there's an effort underway again to reintroduce that legislation. Here in the province of BC, there has been UN Declaration legislation introduced that creates a framework for discussion around how we actually implement But of course, there's a lot of people that are really concerned that somehow we're going to lose out on something if we implement the UN Declaration. And again, when we start thinking about futures, that's kind of an example of like how we've got to turn this from a win-loss scenario to a win-win, right? And we actually start seeing this as being an essential part of our overall growth as a society, that human rights and the pursuit of human rights actually serves us collectively in good stead. And there's a whole bunch that we can unpack there, but basically when the rights of one are weakened, our overall human rights framework is weakened. And you know, that's another session that we can do one time.
For sure.
Yeah.
It's a powerful piece of the work that you're doing, and I wanted to thank you again. Thank you for your passion, Rye. You know, your empathy for the children that have been impacted by the residential school experience, and the important work that you continue to do now at the University of Victoria. I certainly invite those that are attending to learn more, learn more about the residential school experience, stay engaged, find new ways for your family, your workplace, your volunteer organization, your churches to demonstrate in new and meaningful fashions what reconciliation can mean in this country. It's an ongoing process. It's one that we can't just put by the wayside. So again, my thanks to you, Rye. We'll wrap up now for the audience. Just a couple of quick slides. A reminder that the Calgary Club has an upcoming presentation on December 17th. Keep posted for Canadian Club of Edmonton events. We'll post on our website as soon as we can. Our thanks to the ADR Institute of Alberta for loaning us technical and Zoom expertise for today's presentation. And of course, stay posted for future Canadian Club of Edmonton luncheons. There's a website. You can register for a free newsletter. Rye, again, my sincere thanks. I look forward to the next chance we get to meet, and as all of us, we hope soon to meet again in person in some fashion in the days ahead. Don't be a stranger. If you're in Edmonton or Calgary, please look us up. You'd be a welcome addition to anything we're doing.
Wonderful.
Goodbye to the membership and those that were attending today. Thanks again for participating. Bye-bye.